In the spring of 1810, David Thompson, a partner in the Canadian Northwest Company, engaged Jocko Finley, a free hunter who had worked both for the company and Thompson for many years, to build a trading post central to the Spokane tribe. The selected site was Nemchensen, the gathering place, the main fishing camp of the Middle Spokane people at the junction of the Spokane and Little Spokane rivers. During the next 15 years, this site served as the economic hub of the Columbia District fur trade. In 1812, the Pacific Fur Company, an American venture, built their own trading posts next to Spokane House and at other locations to compete head-to-head with the Northwest Company for the beaver fur trade. In the fall of 1813, the Northwest Company bought out the Americans and moved into their bigger and better fortified Spokane House post. Ross Cox, a Pacific Fur Company clerk, was at Spokane House in 1813 and later wrote some general descriptions of activities around the post. Outside of the salmon season, Cox said that the men lived principally on deer, trout, and carp, and occasionally killed a fat horse as a substitute for beef. By 1815, the supply line shifted to the Columbia River. The pelts went downstream to Fort George, previously Astoria, and from there were shipped to England and China. The China trade was mainly for tea, silk, and opium. The trade goods were shipped from England to Fort George for distribution up the Columbia to the inland posts. As the Hudson's Bay Company absorbed the Northwest Company business operations between 1819 and 1821, many of the men simply switched companies and the post continued to operate in much the same manner. The only surviving Spokane House journal, from the outfit of 1822-23, describes men, women, and children tending a potato garden outside the stockade, an active blacksmith and pit saw, tribal and fur trade salmon weirs on the Little Spokane River, and an ambitious remodeling project on the buildings and palisade. Beginning in 1818, Donald Mackenzie led a series of ambitious Snake River expeditions south from Spokane House through the Walla Walla country. The 1822 annual report describes a snake country venture led by Finan McDonald that left Spokane House with 51 men, including many Hawaiians. Over the next 10 years, these annual expeditions were staged from Fort Walla Walla and expanded into Oregon, Utah, Nevada, and California. The Spokane House journal keepers noted extensive tribal movements both around the trade house and on regular annual rounds during the course of the year. Visiting tribes included the Spokane, Colville, Lakes, Coeur d'Alene, Kalispell, Kootenai, Flathead, Okanagan, and Nez Perce. While beaver, muskrat, and other pelts were traded by the Indians, they also traded horses, fish, fresh deer meat, and berries for beaver credits at Spokane House. If the beaver's lodge was its castle, then the waterways were its kingdom. When Europeans discovered that the underfur of the beaver's pelt was excellent for making hats, then the beaver became the basis for the entire economy of the region. Beaver fur is to this day the best fiber for hat material. Both gentlemen's top hats and military hats of felted beaver fur were very much in demand from the middle 1600s to the middle 1800s. French-Canadian, Iroquois, and Métis trappers known as beaver hunters made their living by traveling with the Northwest Company across Canada and into the Oregon Territory, producing over half the beaver pelts for the company in the Upper Columbia District. While a few men brought their Cree wives and children with them, many more married local Salish women and settled permanently in the inland Northwest, making the production of furs for trade a family operation. Beaver trapping was hard work and done in all kinds of weather. As there were no rubber boots in the early 1800s, the trappers had to get wet, wading in the water to set the traps and retrieve their catch. They usually wore knee breeches, and when trapping, encased their lower legs in thick blanket wool with an outer pair of buckskin moccasins. The trappers knew that wool, even when wet, was a good insulator, but still had to endure nearly frozen feet at times. The beaver and other fur bearers, after being caught, were skinned rough in the field to cut down on weight for transportation back to camp. The trapping families would have a main camp, and the men would go out from there up various streams looking for beaver sign. They were always looking for beaver dams and lodges that could be seen at a distance. The trappers were also searching for beaver slides, those trails where the beaver went out of the water to either make a scent mound or cut brush for food. This was the prime location to set a trap. The beaver hunters' wives and younger children would stay in camp, mending clothing, preparing hides, and doing other chores. Everyone shared in the camp life. The beaver hunters and their families traveled mostly on horseback throughout the inland Northwest. As there were no matches in the early 1800s, Europeans started fires with sparks made by striking flint and steel together. Steel strikers quickly became an important trade item with the Indian people. For the beaver hunter, being able to start a fire in cold, wet weather was his most important survival skill. During the trapping season, beaver meat was often made into a stew for a main meal, both morning and evening. Depending on location and season, a variety of roots and berries might be added to the beaver stew. Pacific Fur Company clerk Ross Cox mentions in his journal that our principal subsistence while in the woods was horseflesh and boiled rice. Since rice was a trade item at Spokane House, it might also be boiled with beaver meat. Wheat flour was also available as a trade item and often simply mixed with water to make a dough, then baked or fried. These small bannocks might be called hardtack today. The bannocks, if kept dry, would not spoil and made a good trail food. Beaver pelts had to be scraped of their flesh and then laced on hoops for drying to keep from spoiling. Stems of local woods such as willow, serviceberry, and mountain maple were bent into hoops for stretching the beaver pelts. Lacing materials could range from codline, a trade item, to rawhide thongs. These dried pelts, once traded, were baled into 90-pound packs and shipped, prior to 1813, back across Canada to Lake Superior, then to Montreal, and on to England.
Lads and lassies, tobacco on the prairie! Trading will commence.
Tobacco was essential for conducting fur trade business. No trades were made without tobacco provided by the trader. Ross Cox tells of how tobacco prompted a 72-mile horse race between the Northwest Company and the Pacific Fur Company to reach a large party of Flathead Indians with a quantity of valuable skins. Cox states, whichever